All right, let's skip forward a couple thousand years. So Aristotle was writing about 400 BC. We're going to skip up to the late 1500s AD, and we're going to skip from Greece up to England. So this Perkins thing that I have you read is a really good expression of what is nowadays known as the Protestant work ethic, which is a very important foundational part of American life in particular. It was brought over to the Massachusetts colony from Puritans in the east of England. Now, to understand this, I'm going to have to say a couple of things about Catholicism and Protestantism. I'm not trying to report the truth, which I'm not qualified to do. I'm telling you how Perkins saw these things. So Perkins and other early Protestants, they looked at medieval Catholicism, right? So the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. And they saw, this, very complicated hierarchy of, priests and popes and cathedrals and all this stuff. But specifically, they saw this part of it, monasteries and monks, and they thought there was something creepy and wrong about that. They thought there was something creepy and wrong about an awful lot of the money that the Catholic Church had, but specifically a monastery where people gather to turn away from the world and basically do very little other than read the Bible all the time, and live on alms, struck them as weird. Now, the thing is that the idea of having monks in a monastery who spend almost all of their time praying or reading the Bible aloud or copying the Bible or something like that, in its weird way, that's actually what Aristotle thought that the best life was like. Because here were people trying to form a union with God by way of this text. Aristotle had been thinking about people forming a union with a kind of a scientific God by way of scientific contemplation. But here we've got people trying to merge themselves by way of this book and prayer with, a slightly different flavor of God. So the monk was a kind of a religious elite who lived for union with God. They don't do anything practical, and they live on the efforts of others, which is exactly what Aristotle's ruling class was like. Protestants objected to the privileging of monks over other people. They thought, look, my work is just as divinely inspired as yours is, and they did not care for the hierarchy. We're not below you just because you spend all of your time reading the Bible, and we don't owe you alms just because we're not monks. So they were obliged to say that secular work was just as much the work of God as regular work. Where regular, by the way, it means to rule, which means that it fell under like the rule of Saint Benedict or the rule of Saint Francis. So it was a monastic rule in the Catholic Church. So the monk would do what was called the work of God, and that was scripture reading and prayer and things like that. Right? So the monk was held to be doing a higher kind of work than what everyday people were doing, farmers and artisans and all the rest of regular people. So the Protestants came along and said, no, your regular work in your monastery is not more important than our secular work, where secular means worldly, outside of the monastery. So Perkins and other Protestants said, we each have a vocation. Vocation, the voca in that is the same as vocal, so it's a calling from God. And it's what God wants you to do, right? God has a big plan for the whole universe, and you have a tiny part to play in it, and so he put you exactly where you were supposed to be so that you could, through your own choices, hopefully make the right contribution to the universe as a whole. Perkins figures that each one of us has two vocations, so God has kind of called each of us twice. One of them is your general vocation, and this is a vocation that everybody has, and it's basically the same. This is your vocation as a Christian. This is like Aristotelian science in that it is depersonalized. The scientific truths that two Aristotelian scientists contemplate are exactly the same truths, and the ideal that different scientists aspire to is full identity with God, and that's the same as identity with each other. And that is what Catholic monks were going for. But Perkins and the other Protestants looked at this and said, look, once you have sort of effaced yourself, once you have rendered yourself completely generic, who in particular goes to heaven? Right? Back in Aristotle, we had people trying to escape from the burden of time by embedding themselves into some kind of intellectual excellence, especially science. And Omar Khayyam was saying, time really presses on us. We should try to liberate ourselves from that feeling with, food, drunkenness, sex, and poetry. But Protestants are not interested in being freed from the pressure of time. Protestants think that we should feel time very heavily because the judgment of God weighs on us and we are defined by the reckoning toward which we are moving. Right? So the Protestant is going to be more individualistic. He's going to say, look, your time determines who you are, and you need to get things right before you are judged. So they're going to introduce the idea of a particular vocation. Your particular vocation is the work you've been called to do as the particular person that you are sent into the world at this place and time to fulfill some particular part of God's plan. And here, the key point is, in fulfilling this vocation, you're creating a distinctive self. You're turning yourself into the person who did this work. So let's say that God calls you to be a carpenter, and then you are. Okay, when you get to heaven, you can be asked, well, who in particular are you? And you can point to the houses you built and say, I'm the one that built those houses. Nobody else built those houses, right? I'm not substitutable for somebody else, right? When two monks get up to heaven, the angel or whatever says, hey, who are you? And each one of them says, I'm the guy who read those chunks of the Bible. Well, which one of you is which? We can't tell the difference, right? Whereas when you do some kind of actual production of something in the world, you did that, and now you are somebody, right? So the thought is that through you fulfilling your productive calling, you're making yourself into somebody, and that makes you someone in particular who can sort of go to heaven. There are two different components of your particular calling. One of them is your kind of social foundation calling, and this has to do with your roles in your society as a member of your sex, as someone with your class status, your relationship to your government. But the more important one is your productive calling, which is your particular work. Your particular productive calling is your way of making a distinct contribution to the common good, right? So God has designed the universe as a whole, including your society, and then put you in your society with the task of making some stuff that is conducive to the common good. So you can see that there's a hint of utilitarianism back there. And then he is going to say, well, how can you tell what your calling is? There's no literal phone that you pick up and then it's God calling and God says, hey, I need you to, right? So you're going to need something a little bit subtler. He says, you might find a knack for it. It'll be made kind of salient to you by the circumstances. And if you just run forward a couple of hundred years, you're going to have Adam Smith give an answer to that question. It's the most profitable thing, right? So we're leading up toward the idea of division of labor and self-interest being a way that you can determine what is your best contribution to your society. And then just a couple of details to add on. Creativity, right? So if you are able to make things that are completely new, you're a poet or an architect or something, that's a gift to be exploited. So that's always salient. If you find yourself with a number of gifts and one of them is toward something creative, then God has made that one salient, and you should be pursuing that one. And if you don't find that, great. It's not that God thinks that other people are less worthwhile. They just have different distinctive tasks. But there are fewer creative people than there are other people, so if you think you might be one of the creative people, then that's definitely something to look into. And second, scholarship and education make it so that other people can figure out their callings and pursue them much better. So if you feel that you might be called to be an educator, that is a special calling and you should consider that to be sort of salient. And if you're not, that's fine, because not everybody can teach. All right, so let's wrap up thinking about the place of work in life by looking at Karl Marx. So Marx was a philosopher of labor, and he was really acute at that. He was an economist, and there were some glitches there, and he was a revolutionary, and that mostly has not worked out great. So we're going to focus on the part of what he had to say that's that's interesting and maybe worthwhile. So let's put together two people that we already looked at. So we looked at Adam Smith, and he wanted to say that productivity is social, that the only way that you know what to produce is because that is the thing that is bringing the highest prices, and that is a fact that only exists because people are buying and selling things with money in a social context. Right, so Smith wanted to emphasize the social nature of production. On the other hand, glance back at Norman Bowie. So he was the Kantian business ethicist that we read when we were thinking about how Kant thinks about money and daily activity. Bowie wanted to say that meaningful work is work that expresses who you are as a person. We can also see that idea from Perkins, right? That there should, in a way, be a story that we tell leading up to you getting into a line of work, and we can kind of see how it is that you go from not being in that line of work to being in it. Right? And it's not like circumstances would never intervene. It's not like every time anybody gets a job, even a good job, that it's just exactly what we would have expected them to do. But still, there should be some kind of a coherent narrative where their life makes some sense. And going from not yet having that job to having it is a decision that makes sense. It's a piece of what you can identify as progress. So Smith says that productivity is social. It makes sense in a social context. Bowie, trying to express Kant, said that work makes sense in the personal context of the particular employee's life. Marx agrees with both of those. He thinks that work is a social activity that needs to be chosen by you. And in choosing and doing your work, you make yourself the particular person you'll be. So this is an idea that I'm not going to say that Marx got it from the Protestant work ethicists, but he certainly agrees with them about it. So what he thinks is, here's the trick with being human. Human beings, for Aristotle, are kind of disappointing until they form large cities, and then there is a leisure class that can do science and pure activities and athletics and things like that. Marx thinks that that is weird. Marx thinks that we are animals, and we are animals that do not have much in the way of instinct. So we have to press our minds to the problem of survival. And what makes you the individual that you are is the specific way in which you choose some work that you're going to do to preserve yourself by way of making a contribution to your society as a whole. So he says that chosen labor is the species being of human beings. And what that means is that it's what we find fulfillment in. It is our nature or our happiness or our function. Right? So Aristotle had thought that the use of the intellect as an end in itself was the human function. Marx thinks that the use of the intellect for productive work is the human function. So he wants to say, every living thing over time is a self-creating being, because every living thing, like Aristotle said, eats and grows. But people are self-creating in that sense, and also in the sense that we give ourselves unique identities with our work. Right, so we have division of labor. You did not do all of the things necessary for your own survival. You made specific contributions to it. So you don't make a generic contribution to a generic person. You make your own very specific personal contribution in your particular social context as an expression of your particular individual personality. So you make yourself this particular human being. You make yourself. Right? When you make a bunch of houses, you're making houses, but you're also turning yourself from a generic human being into a carpenter. So you are just as much a product of your own labor as anything in the world around yourself that you have built. You are an artifact of your own efforts. So what's our reason supposed to be to believe this? Right? Aristotle gave us an argument for his view about the use of the intellect as an end in itself being the human function. All right, the trouble with his argument is that given that life is short and you can't spend all of your time in union with God as a scientific contemplator, somebody is going to have to do all of the productive work. And Aristotle says, well, human fulfillment requires that there be a whole bunch of inadequate human beings to do all of the labor for us, which doesn't make any sense. You can't say that the species normally requires some kind of radical disjoint between some happy parasites at the top and some hardworking but inferior things at the bottom. Human beings don't work that way. right? We're not built so that some of us are naturally capable of managing our own lives and other people are not. Right? So there's a problem with Aristotle's conception about human well-being. He thinks that you can live well only because somebody else is genetically inferior to you and is doing your labor for you. And Marx is not having that. Marx wants to say, look, we don't have like a queen in our hive or something and then a whole bunch of workers and a whole bunch of drones or something. Right? We're all basically similarly positioned to run our own lives and make our own decisions. And of course, some people are unusually wise or clever or smart or farsighted or great at planning. And some people, of course, are deficient in various ways. And, there, might be some curtailments of, some people's abilities to make their decisions. But still, as a general rule, everybody is about equally capable of running their own lives. So, given that we don't have queens, drones, workers, and stuff by genetics, it can't be in our nature that some of us get excluded from happiness while other people get included in happiness. Right? The human function is the same for everybody. So you can't have everybody doing pure science, but you can have everybody working for a living. So he concludes the human function is to work for a living. And he wants to give a specific, slightly narrower argument about how science and things like labor and technology are supposed to go together. So what is the relationship between science on the one hand and technology and technique and productive work and craft knowledge and artisanship and basically working for a living? What is the relationship between these two things? Aristotle thought that they basically don't have anything to do with one another, that we've got a whole bunch of people at sort of the bottom of our society who have to use technique, artisanship, technology to produce some wealth, and then other people get to do science, and they don't have anything to do with one another. All right, ordinary Americans have a belief about the relationship between technology and science that is just flatly wrong. I don't think that there's very many times that I say in this class, here is a view and it is false, but here is a view and it is false. You can even find this as a definition somewhere online. Americans nowadays think that technology is applied science, and that is just the absolute silliest thing that anybody has ever said. Right? Science requires that you have a scientific method. It requires that you have the logic of scientific laws and observations. It requires that you have something like observations or experiments. Fire was not discovered as the result of physics. It's kind of the other way around, right? We've been technological far longer than we've been scientific. Even once we started to have science, which we've had in some form or another for about 2,500 years, it never had anything to do with technology until just a couple of hundred years ago, right? People were tinkering and they would, generate knowledge and stuff while they were trying to build better machines. But nobody was going, here are the scientific theories and the scientific results. How is that going to help me build a better machine? Until very recently. Technology is not applied science. That is definitely false. Whether it's totally separate, like Aristotle thought, is a separate thing, but it is not applied science. Marx's view is that science is applied technology. And you might think, well, that's extremely weird. Don't you have to have science first? No. And here's an example. Think about geometry, which is kind of like science, right? Which is kind of a science. The geo in geometry is the same geo from geology and geography. It means having to do with the earth. And the metry is just what it sounds like. It's the measurement of something. Geometry is surveying, right? It's figuring out whose plot of land starts where and how high the rivers are going to rise this year and things like that, right? People had to have the technology of land surveying before they could sort of start playing with it and end up with geometry. Likewise, try astronomy and calendars. Right? People needed to keep track of the days and the months and the years. They needed to be able to keep track of, when the river was going to rise and when you needed to harvest your crops by and things like that. They needed that way before we started to try to figure out what the little dots in the heavens are, before we started figuring out about stars and planets and all the rest of it. right? So we started with calendar design, and then we moved on to astronomy, not the other way around. You don't start with physics and then move to engineering. Until the last couple hundred years, engineers had nothing to do with physics whatsoever. Even when you get up to like heat pumps and stuff, people were not paying attention. People who were designing steam pumps and heat engines, they were not paying attention to physicists talking about thermodynamics. To the contrary, once you have enough people fiddling with enough machines, you start to have someone who can look at them and start just thinking about them, and then you end up with physics. Likewise, anything microscopic, right, microbiology, any kind of chemistry, that's just glasses, but more so, right? We had lenses to help us just see regular life long before we started trying to create extreme lenses to let us, quote, see things that are otherwise completely invisible, right? So Marx's claim is that science is technology once you're only playing with it. And that's way more likely than our view that technology is applied science, and it's kind of more likely than Aristotle's view that science and technology have nothing to do with one another, too. So Marx has some interesting points there. Unfortunately, there's this problem. So remember that he agrees with Smith that labor and productivity are social, and he also agrees with people like Kant and Bowie that labor should be an expression of you as an individual. The trouble is that productivity is social, and what that means is that people pay attention to prices and profit potential, and so they're able to accidentally serve the common good just by looking to their own profit. And they do that by recreating a division of labor according to an entrepreneurial discovery. So that is to say, the fact that labor is social means that entrepreneurs discover things and then they hire people to work out their discoveries. They hire labor and then they divide the labor, and that's how it is they make us all richer. But if an entrepreneur has figured out how your job is supposed to go, then it isn't an expression of you, it's an expression of the entrepreneur. Right? So what the problem is, if everybody were to pick the job that expressed their personality, we might all be poets or something. Whereas if we all do the job that is most socially beneficial, we would all be doing things that we found uninteresting and had no real relationship to our personalities or who we were. And unfortunately, there's no obvious way to solve both of these problems, to both figure out what's conducive to overall well-being, what kind of labor is most productive for your society as a whole, and also figure out what kind of labor is most expressive of your personality. Marx was a socialist. Socialism's idea is that we will sort of, instead of paying attention to people buying and selling things and trying to make a profit, that involves someone making an entrepreneurial discovery and somebody else doing what they're told, will sort of coordinate and cooperate. That involves basically a gigantic meeting of everybody in your society who are all going to say all of the things that they want. Instead of paying for them, they're going to say what they want, and they'll all say what they would like to do. Instead of offering their labor for a fee, they will say things. And then we're going to somehow or other accommodate all of that information together. And that's a really big meeting. And historically, socialism has had some successes, right? So the trick with the price signaling stuff is, if you can't tell what people need, because we are talking about beyond basic food, clothing, and shelter and stuff, then you're going to pay attention to what they're willing to pay for, and that tells you what they want or need. Whereas when you can tell, then you don't need that, right? So there have been a number of cases where a country has adopted socialism, and this has regularized food, clothing, shelter, healthcare in a number of cases. So there are times and places where socialism has observably improved the well-being of some people in terms of some baseline goods. But once you get past that, they don't seem to have too much in the way of success. And there is a reason for that. It's because no one's buying or selling anything anymore, so it's hard to figure out what anything is worth to anybody else. So unless you're literally having a meeting of your entire population, it's hard to figure out what's the most productive kind of labor to do. So you kind of have to have somebody telling you what to do, and that's the problem back with Adam Smith and entrepreneurial discovery. So this might be an insoluble problem. It's certainly a very serious problem, and it's sort of the entire 20th century was one colossal conflict over exactly that issue, which we still have not come anywhere near to resolving. So here sort of are your big three options about the place of labor in your life. You might think that Aristotle is right, that intellectual excellence strictly for its own sake, without any kind of productive future, is the best life, in which case work is bad, and we should try to avoid working if we at all possibly can. Or you could agree with Adam Smith, who's sort of the more conventional American style view that says that work is good, and you don't really necessarily need to know why it is that the work that you're doing is worth doing. People are willing to pay you for it. You don't really need to know why you are pursuing your own, at least financial self-interest, and because people are willing to pay you for something, they must like it, so you must be pursuing the common good anyway. And then Marx's view, which is that work is good, but it's only good insofar as it is an expression of you and your character and your decisions. So just trying to do what is most profitable turns you into a generic person. It turns you into just anybody who did whatever happened to be the thing that was most profitable. So it sort of turns you back into a Catholic monk or an Aristotelian scientist. And so there are some options, and given that we in the United States strongly define ourselves by our labor and our jobs, this is a thing worth thinking about for Americans in particular.